This is fun. I don't get to, I don't have to answer any questions. I get to grill these two esteemed chefs at the panel. I'm really excited to introduce both these chefs. They're both good friends of mine. They're people that I've known forever. Tremendously respect both of them. And to have all three of us in a room together is kind of a special night. So to my right, Beverly Kim of Parachute Restaurant in Chicago. If you've not been, please go. It's a wonderful restaurant that really kind of redefines Korean food in Chicago. She's celebrating 10 years of Parachute, which in like restaurant years is like 100 years. It's super successful. 2019, she won the Beard Award for Best Chef Chicago. She's also co-owner with her husband of Avelia, is that right? Anelia. She's also founder of Abundance Setting, which is a nonprofit that supports working women and mothers in the hospitality industry, something that's really important. So please give her a nice round of applause. And then if you guys are local, you all know Danny, hometown hero, chef owner of Mandu, Anju, multiple CHIKO, I Egg You, so many restaurants. He's got 9 restaurants total. Started in 2006 and has now grown an empire here. I think Anju was Restaurant of the Year when it first came out. Yeah. So you guys, he doesn't need any introduction, but Danny Lee, someone who I think has really paved the way and carved out a huge space for Korean Americans and all Asian Americans here in DC. So please give it up for Danny. So. We're here to talk about Korean food and Korean chefs. It's Korean Day, and I want to get y'all's perspective on the popularity of Korean food. Not to date myself, but I remember a time when Korean food, when I was a kid, when Korean food, I grew up in New York, when Korean food was so obscure and no one knew what kimchi was, and it was stinky, and my grandmother used to always make doenjang and put it on the windowsill. And it was something that was just so foreign. And if you'd have told me, you know, when I was 15, that Korean food would be like the trending food in America, I would have said you were insane. But you think about that, in just a few short decades, Korean food has become one of the trendiest foods in America. It's kind of really taken over, and I think both of you have done a lot to pave that way. So, and people always ask me, and I'm always curious, and I don't have the answer for it, like how and why did Korean food make that leap from being really just obscure? You know, I remember like Japanese food was popular, right? Vietnamese food had its moment, and Korean food seemed like it was never just going to have that moment, and it just exploded. So, in your estimation, like, what do you think contributed to that? Either of you. Don't be shy.
You know, my mom and I opened up Mandu, our first restaurant, in 2006. And even though it doesn't seem that long ago, you know, that was 17, 18 years ago. And that was pre-BTS, you know, pre the rise of K-pop, or the wave, as people like to call it. And we were, at that point, DC's only full-service Korean restaurant. And I remember a lot of like the early reviews, or food writers or bloggers. Well, bloggers didn't exist back then, but writers would come in and they're like, oh, you know, it's a good time to open right now because, you know, you're writing the crest like Korean food's about to have its moment, right? And then we opened up a second Mandu in 2011, and like, oh my God, you know, good timing. You know, you're hitting the wave of when Korean food's gonna be popular. And I was like, I heard this 5 years ago. I think it really was just like a slow build, you know, of letting people know what Korean food is and about through different vehicles. I think it started with Korean barbecue, and that was kind of a necessary vehicle for the states to really wrap their heads around what Korean food was, and it's a safe way for non-Koreans to get an introduction to Korean food. You know, it's very approachable. It's basically meat that's just grown in front of you. It's a really novel, fun way to eat. It was different than a Japanese, you know, hibachi steakhouse. And then through that, with the banchan, you know, you got to introduce, you know, Americans to kimchi, you know, to banchan, to jigaes. And I think that's a reason why you see every, metropolitan area in the surrounding suburbs that are densely populated, where the first Korean restaurant in your neighborhood probably was a Korean barbecue restaurant, right? And that served a necessary purpose, I think, of introducing, Korean food to the States. But if you fast forward to now, it's completely different. And I think you can't ignore the fact that different forms of media have provided for what we do for a living now. Whether that's music or TV, all forms of media has really spurred an interest in Korea in general. And like all, I think, cultures, a lot of people like to first experience that new culture to them through food. And, not to put it in the simplest terms, but, my mom, when Anju won, Best Restaurant, she didn't credit, being a typical Korean mother. She'd never likes to give praise on her son. Instead, she was like, "Oh, it's because BTS." I was like, "What?" She's part of the army. You know what I mean? So
does your mom think it's crazy to see this explosion of Korean food? Like coming from someone who's way older than us and has that history back from Korea. To see it.
She does. She thinks it's crazy to see kimchi in Safeway.
Yeah.
But that's a real thing. When she immigrated in 1969, right, to Illinois, actually, she had to use different types of ground pepper flakes, to make kimchi, right? She couldn't get mu, So for her now to just walk through her neighborhood grocery store in Vienna, Virginia, and to find not just one but multiple brands of kimchi in the aisles is explodes her mind.
Yeah. You think, Beverly, especially being in the Midwest, do you think Chicago had a slower kind of introduction to Korean food than, let's say, than New York and California?
Yeah, I think being in the Midwest, I grew up in Chicago. We had a strong Koreatown in the 80s, Lawrence Avenue. But me growing up in the burbs and still people didn't know what the difference was between Korean and Chinese or it kind of was hard for me to explain that. But even fast forward into Top Chef, right? Our season, 11, right? 2009, something around there. It was, I can't even remember, but it was around that time, even some of the chefs on there were asking me, what is Korean cuisine? And that would shock me because it was 2010 and some of them never had Korean food before. That was shocking to me. A couple stories, in 2001, I worked for Charlie Trotter's and we had a guest chef come from Montreal, I think it was called Toke. And it was the hot chef from Montreal. We did this whole dinner together, and then all the cooks went out, and they're like, Beverly, take us out to a 24-hour Korean restaurant. And I got really nervous because, oh, no, they want me to order for the whole group and everything. So I did. They're like, order for us. And the head chef, I remember the whole time, though, she got, her face was red, and she was almost so mad she was crying because she said she couldn't handle the heat of the kimchi, and she couldn't handle anything past white pepper, and she could only handle white pepper. And then, so I felt really apologetic, feel really I'm ashamed bringing them here. And then I was trying to explain all the different kimchis, and she was like, no, I don't know what that is. That's daikon radish, and with chili and vinegar. And I was like, oh my gosh, you're not even listening to me. That's a mu radish, And I just remember wow, even in my own culinary professional industry, it's like a dismissal of Korean food. But then at the same time, rubbing around cooks that were interested and into Korean food because of the fermentation. So there was almost, I think it's a combination of cooks coming up in the professional culinary world, rubbing against the Western cooks, and some of them were like, that's not for me. And some of them were like, hey, I'm really into this. Tell me more. Tell me more about this kimchi, this fermentation. I'm really into it. And then you have chefs like Roy Choi, making it cool, accessible, Kogi, the truck, it kind of brought a fun pop culture to it. And when I was working I couldn't find a Korean restaurant that I could work in, actually, even though I had a passion for Korean food in 2010s. I couldn't find, either it was mom and pop and they didn't hire you, but there was no one really taking it to the next level. So then it became my goal to open my own version of Korean food, a Korean American experience in Chicago. That was my far off dream. It was like a far-fetched dream, like long-term goal, and for it to actualize in 2014 was really a blessing. And I think that kind of broke the ground. But before that, and consulting with chefs and things like that, some chefs would say, oh, you have to mix Korean with Vietnamese and Thai. They're not just gonna go for Korean food. Some people, so there was some like insecurity with calling it Korean American, or what to call it. Do I call it Korean? Do I call it American cuisine? Do I call it Korean American? Like that whole putting it in a box was really scary because I didn't want Koreans to think this wasn't Korean enough. I didn't want other people think it was too creative or too off the mark. So I just realized I had to be myself. And I think with Korean American chefs doing that kind of helped introduce them into, not all of it was super Korean, but some of it kind of helped bring people into the Korean perspective, Korean American perspective. And I think we've slowly evolved even more. And especially with social media now and such great Netflix shows about Korean food, it's like an explosion now. So yeah, I'm super proud and amazed, but I'm also shocked too, how much it went from being apologetic about this cuisine, I'm sorry about the smell, I'm sorry for, is this too spicy, or to being people embracing it. That has been a huge mountain for us.
And I think Korean American chefs are still today in 2024 still trying to figure out what it means. And which segues to my next question is what is Korean food, right? So to me, every immigrant cuisine comes to America, right? And especially Asian, we sort of hyper-focus on one thing, right? So when Japanese food became popular, it was sushi, and everything was sushi. Even though Japanese food has an entire portfolio and range of cuisines, but sushi became the catchword, right? And so it's sushi, or with Vietnamese food, it's pho. Right? And I think with Korean food, it became Korean barbecue, right? That was the thing that you went at 2 in the morning. That was what was known. That was kalbi and all that. So, but neither of you do Korean. I mean, you do, but neither of you have a Korean barbecue restaurant. So when you guys were opening your Korean restaurants, right? So you have an entire range of Korean food to do. How do you decide what's going to be on your menu? How did you decide, what am I going to focus on with Korean food? Is it just the greatest hits? Am I going to do this? Am I going to make this kind of kimchi? Because also too, with both of you, especially with Mandu, it was so early on that there wasn't really a blueprint to do, I want to say a non-mom and pop Korean restaurant, right? In a metropolitan area. How did you figure out what, in your head, at some point, you probably had to ask yourself the question, what is Korean food? Or what's the Korean food that I want to serve at my restaurant? So can you talk a little bit about, what was that process for you? Was it a collaboration between your mom? Was it something that you had, I'm sure you had some fights with your mom about what's going to get on the menu, right? Because she probably had a different version of Korean food than you did, growing up in America. So talk a little bit about that process and what is Korean American or what is Korean food back then, and what do you think Korean food is now?
I think being Korean American, right, being born in the States, my early definition of Korean food was what my mom cooked for me, right? And I think that's the same for the majority of Korean Americans in this room and everywhere else. You know, your first experience is what your parents cook for you, and maybe if you grew up in an area that had Korean restaurants around you, you know, the ones that your parents would take you to are some of their favorites. That develops your palate or what you think are great Korean restaurants because you're going off of what your parents' palate is, right? And those are the experiences that you grew up with, and that kind of shapes your early memories of what Korean food should be, you know, here in the States. And then as you grow older and become an adult and start to take yourself to restaurants or travel around, it opens your eyes to more than what your mom just cooked for you, right? And as, you know, I have the unique experience of opening up a restaurant with my mother, right? And I think that, I don't recommend that for anyone. Like, do not do that. But, you know, I think you have this, you know, to answer your question, you know, I had this American upbringing, right? And I have a expert of Korean cuisine being my mother. And I was kind of the perfect sounding board for her to write our initial menu at Mandu because I'm American, right? I knew through my friends and just being in the restaurant industry what I thought would be an approachable menu that still kept to our core values of being Korean, while not, again, this was 2006 again, while not doing anything that I thought wouldn't be a waste of our time and efforts that wouldn't sell. Like, for instance, I've told the story before, but tteokbokki, right? Chewy, Korean chewy rice cakes. I wanted to put that on our initial menu, but my mom was so scared that white Americans would choke and die in our restaurants. This is a true story, and she was not being like funny. Like, she really thought that only Koreans had the ability to chew and swallow Korean rice cakes.
Do you keep a statistic of how many people have died since 2006?
Only a couple. So we put it on the menu, and as we're testing it, we gave it to our staff who weren't Korean. The majority of them were white, and they ate them. I was like, see, they're still alive. She was like, that's so surprising. And I'm like, oh my God. But it really was like a lot of tough conversations that we had to have and growing pains. I talked about this earlier today. You know, when we first opened up Mandu, we had no idea what would sell, what wouldn't sell. So we played it very safe, right? Even putting kimchi on the menu was a challenge because there's so much work involved in making kimchi, right? The amount of space you need, especially being in a city where you don't have a lot of space to begin with in a city restaurant kitchen, right? So to make hundreds of pounds of kimchi a week, to not just use for panjang, but to use for jjigae, for bokkeumbap, you know, is quite an undertaking. And we're like, is this worth it, right? And then fast forward to now, where now do we not only sell a lot of kimchi, you know, we can serve like aged kimchi. Like when Anju first opened, since we were delayed for a bit, we had a stockpile of kimchi that we had made in preparation for the Anju opening. So we served something called 100-day kimchi. So it was a super aged kimchi. And it was almost like, it's almost like a wine. It changes, like it gets a little bit fruity. You know, the fermentation is stronger, the texture of the cabbage completely changes. And we would serve them side by side with our house, like 30-day kimchi, and then the 100-day age. You can really taste the difference. And it was shocking to me how quickly we sold out of that, because fermentation in the past 10 years has taken on a world of its own. It's a really popular segment of the food industry. And we were joking about this earlier. It's like it's almost like a hipster badge of honor, right? To like be like, oh, you know, give me the funkiest and most fermented item you have on the menu. And that's what kimchi is now. A lot of people make their own kimchis at home. So it's a lot easier now for us to delve deeper into the Korean realm of Korean food. And what is Korean food? You know, I think it's not a simple answer. You know, I think to me, to put it simply, it's care and passion and time, right? It's a food that is meant to invoke a memory, you know, in your mind, where even if you haven't had Korean food before, you take your first bite, it takes you back to some nostalgic place of warmth. You know, juk, for instance, right? Korean rice porridge. There are a lot of dishes like that across ethnicities, across countries. But you take one bite of that, if you've never had juk before, you feel like an embrace over you, right? And I feel like Korean food has that property where it transports you to a different mindset and a different time.
Beverly, I think you do a very unique take on Korean food because I think you take it into, so just to give a little history, like your menu now at Parachute is very different from when you first opened Parachute. And I think when you first opened Parachute, it was very much, I don't want to say, it was very modern. It was a very modern kind of take on Korean food. And all cuisines go through this, right? And there was a time, I don't know, maybe 8, 9 years ago in New York where there was all this, like, there was a couple of restaurants that opened up, they were like, we're gonna do deconstructed bibimbap, you know, and it was like a little bit of shikimchi with, you know, I mean, we've seen it, and it happens, and there is always a time where, like, you modernize a cuisine, whether it's Indian or Filipino or Korean, like, you modernize it, and it looks pretty and it's very nouveau, but it loses the essence and heart and soul. And then there's always that kind of push and pull. I think you do a very good job of kind of modernizing it, making it contemporary, but still keeping the spirit of what is Korean. So can you talk a little bit about your process and, like, how do you know when too far is too much? How do you know when, because, like, your bibimbap is not traditional, but it still feels like a bibimbap even though it's very modern. So, like, how do you decide when to stop? How to, like, you know, create something pretty and you know, delicate without losing the essence of what it means to be Korean?
When I think of Korean food, is like flavor. What comes to mind, it's the combination of the aged deep flavor from the aged kanjang, doenjang, gochujang, mixed with something really fresh, and that together is the essence of Korean food. So when you eat our bibimbap, it still tastes like bibimbap. It has the essential, like, balance of bibimbap, which is a balance. So it has the sesame oils, it has the balance of sweetness, a little bit of sweetness in the gochujang, and some acidity. But yeah, we just had so many different varieties with the dolsot. You know, sometimes we did barbecue tripe, or we did fresh tuna with preserved lemon, and
so when you're doing that, who tells you, like, no, it's too much, or like, no, like, do you have to edit yourself, or do you have someone that you can soundboard off of that goes?
My husband. No. So yeah. I'm very lucky. So we have a unique situation. I'm a husband-wife team. Opening Parachute was also a way for us to raise a family in this industry, which is very difficult to do. He actually studied under Chef Im Ji-ho, the wandering chef from Korea. But he's also a New York French, you know, studied in France, studied, like, modern chef. And then it's our vision together. And when we first opened Parachute, it was almost like all these ideas kind of, like, regurgitated. It was a lot of different ideas. But mainly what centered it was, I think Korean food has a balance to it, which I think it's the texture, the chewiness, or it's like the crispiness with enough balance of the softness, and like the umami mixed with, like, the nuttiness of the sesame or the earthiness. It's kind of quite unique, and the textures from the vegetables, how we cook vegetables, and the fermentation, the lactic fermentation. So it's kind of a complex flavor profiles. I think when we first started Parachute, I wouldn't call it, like, traditional Korean. I would call it Korean American, because it was all the flavors I loved growing up. So I loved pho, I loved curry, I loved all these things that I was exposed to growing up in Chicago. But in a format that was shared like Korean. We had panchan, we had some bibimbap, some things that centered, like a soup, centered it around, like, Korean food, but it was, you know, we had the scallion bean bread with, like, baked potato, loaded baked potato and cheese and sour cream butter that everyone loved, but it wasn't Korean.
It's really Korean, by the way. That's
yeah.
Traditional.
What got to me was people started calling it a Korean bread.
Right.
So that, because the education of Korean food was just, that was the first time they had Korean food, and now
Put it on the menu.
they put everything we did was not Korean. But after that, after now it's been 10 years, I think that doesn't move me as much anymore. And so you have to cook what moves you. I think I always go by the motto, if I believe in it, then someone else is gonna like it. I think the self-editing part is almost even more simple. Like a simple mackerel grilled perfectly on a binchotan grill that's been cured with bourbon barrels, smoked sea salt, but it's the quality of the fish. It's how we brine it. It's how we grill it to order. And I feel like that is more magical than this foam with yuzu kosho and, dehydrated this and that, all these techniques, I think doing Korean food, also what we didn't have 10 years ago was the quality of products coming out of Korea. We didn't have the quality soju and quality, we didn't have access to makgeolli, really artisanal things. And so for Parachute, it was all about putting something artisanal or something, or if it wasn't craft gochujang, you have to turn it into something creative. But now you can get Kisundo craft, she's 180 years passed down ongi gochujang maker, the traditional way of making Korean gochujang and doenjang. So now we can make it more purely that, and maybe some hedgehog mushrooms or something in season. Right? We really rely on our local seasonality to make, because that makes the best delicious food. And I think Korean food, we're always foragers and always using what's around them. So that made Korean food taste good.
Do you, and for both of you, when you get a best restaurant in Washington, when you get a Beard Award, does that give you more confidence and freedom to be playful? Let's say when you first open, you kind of have to really consider what's my audience, what are they going to respond to? Do you feel now that you're more established, you can go, I can put anything on the menu now? Is that a sort of measure of your confidence, or do you think the audience has matured enough that now you can put anything on the menu and it won't seem too weird or strange or too Korean, quote unquote?
I think it's both. I think as a chef, as you gain more experience and generally as you get older, if you're still cooking and still researching and still working on your craft, right? You're going to gain naturally more confidence in what you do. And honestly, it does help if one of your restaurants, does get recognized, by some accolade or award. Does that give you a bit more freedom to push the boundaries a bit more? Of course it does, right? But at the same time, you asked Beverly, who, does she check herself, or does she have, her husband, she can bounce ideas off of. We're really careful across all of our teams to collaborate, and we will dissect the dish if we have an idea, right? My first question is this rooted in Korean cuisine, right? And what I mean is, are the base ingredients, Korean, and the final taste, does it remind you of a Korean dish or a Korean flavor? And if it doesn't, then we work on it so it does, right? And I have problems recently with, especially in New York, right? There are a lot of Korean restaurants New York City has become almost like the epicenter of modern Korean cooking in the States. You have multiple Michelin-starred restaurants, Beard Award winners who are doing wonderful things with Korean food in different smaller settings and different types of formats, and I think it's a beautiful thing to see. And everyone's obsessed with labeling each one separately. One's a modern Korean restaurant, one's a traditional Korean one, one's an authentic Korean restaurant, right? It's all Korean, right? I haven't seen that with French cuisine or Italian cuisine, where French chef, where there's tons of them around the country, right, that are doing innovative things with French cuisine or Italian cuisine, et cetera, right? But you don't see someone saying, pigeonholing each one of those restaurants separately. But for some reason in Korean cuisine, you see these labels being made across these restaurants. And why can't our food be allowed to progress in the States as much as these other foods have had and still be labeled as its essence Korean?
Mm-hmm.
you know.
And that's so I think one of the articles, I think it was a Pete Wells article in the New York Times a couple of months ago, where it said Korean restaurants are at the forefront of fine dining in New York. It was a very fascinating article about the progressive, really hyper fine dining Korean cuisine in New York right now. And I think one of the questions is, it's for you too, it's like, is it Korean? Like, I always find it interesting because you can go to a very high-end French restaurant in New York City or anywhere, and there'll always be something with yuzu in it. And there'll always be something with passion fruit in it. There'll always be something with curry in it. And I'm like, but this isn't French.
Now it'll be kimchi on that.
Now it'll be kimchi on it. But do you think Korean food is allowed to do that, right? So can you have a bibimbap with escargot in it and still call it Korean food? Or do you feel trepidation with that? Or, like, after your beard award, were you just more free and confident, said, you know what, fuck it, I'm just gonna put whatever I want on it because I'm Bev Kim. Like,
yeah, I feel like there's like you said, a double-edged sword. Sometimes people walk in and like, this isn't a Michelin-star restaurant. Like, they're expecting a certain style of service, a certain smoke and mirrors, plush or something. And they're like, this is, because what we're doing right now is just delicious Korean food in my way, like modern Korean cuisine. And so it could be a double-edged sword because maybe it's what their perception of a Michelin star or James Beard should be. And so I try not to let that limit me. I try to focus on what I truly, like the true voice, because I think if you are authentic to yourself, that's the only way you're going to be successful. If you're trying to be somebody else, you're not, you can sense it, so I think that's, but I also think cooking to your audience too, because like Chicago's market is very different from DC market, is different from New York's market, the kind of wealth, the like disposable income that is in each city. I feel like Chicago's kind of like a working class city. So like what can happen in New York with all these like really high-end Korean restaurants, it's harder in Korea. Like maybe there can't be as many, in Chicago. And that's, for me, that's why I wanted to do something casual. Like you can go in and there's casual, but you still get this high level of quality of food. What's another, I feel like a ceiling we need to break is the price point. Because the amount of labor and quality ingredients I have is much higher than I'm charging. I wish I can charge more, but I tried and people complain. And once they complain about price, they don't come back. And they'll tell 10 people not.
And do you think that's still kind of a stereotype of like, well, Asian food has to be a certain price point versus pasta you can charge $38
100%.
for? Yeah.
100%. You can charge, like, Italian restaurants, you can, for like one, like, raviolo, right? They'll charge like $45 for one gigantic raviolo because it has like, a farm egg and like truffles, right? We talked about this earlier, about, a lot of cities, and thankfully they stopped this, but a lot of cities used to do cheap eats lists, right? Top 100 cheap eats in like whatever area you're in. And I guarantee you, if you research back on these lists, right, across the country, top 50 will be all Asian restaurants, right? And I made a big stink about this several years ago because those writers were pigeonholing Asian food to the general reader that only good, authentic Asian food is cheap and in some suburban strip mall, right? And that really limited what we were trying to do to elevate and promote our cuisine, right? And pay homage and heritage to the craft of Korean cuisine specifically, and how much work and time and expense goes into creating some of these dishes where it's not cheap and it shouldn't be cheap, right? Like panchan, is a hot point, where back in the day, and even in Korea, you go to a restaurant and panchan's a staple of the Korean table. Side dishes that are meant to be enjoyed while eating an entree. That costs money. And slowly throughout the years, we've started charging at most of our restaurants, at least for some panchan. Maybe kimchi will be for free, but everything else will be a la carte, right? And the amount of times we will get, some random online review being like, I've never been to a Korean restaurant that charges for panchan. Recently, that's false. Like most Korean restaurants that I've been to will charge for it because your number one, food waste is a gigantic issue globally, right? So let's say you bring out a platter of panchan that normally can have like 10 different side dishes. What if 2 people at that table had a food allergy? Let's say a shellfish allergy. They can't eat the kimchi, right? So it's not going to be eaten. So what's going to happen at the restaurant? You can't just save that. If it hits the table, you have to throw it away, right? Why would we just knowingly contribute to food waste, by keeping that practice? Second of all, it's financial. For a restaurant to survive these days, we're looking at all costs. The amount of time and labor that goes to properly making panchan, right? Again, lacto-fermentation, the time, and doing it in a very controlled environment takes skill, which means high labor, right, and it needs space. Why wouldn't we charge for that, right? But again, sometimes we're our own worst enemy, right? Because you have Korean Americans who come from, let's say LA and Koreatown, where the majority of those restaurants still do like gratis panchan. And they're like, well, you're not a real Korean restaurant because you're charging me for panchan. And that's what I hate. Is you're not a real this because of this. Right?
Yeah, it's like the free bread syndrome, but
Yeah.
like our version is the panchan syndrome.
Yeah.
And it's like, I literally had this review, and it was from a Korean American saying, I can't believe when I order a second one, they had charged me $3 for that one. Because basically, kimchi is like water, isn't it? And I was like, that made my blood boil.
Yeah, what type of water are you drinking that has fermented shrimp paste in it?
No. What kind of water? I was like, that takes 8 hours and like 2 or 3 people working on that. And
I think part of that too goes back to like this whole discussion of free panchan goes back to cheap immigrant labor, right? So the expectation was if you're a new immigrant, you're here, you're gonna get cheap. Your niece is helping you, your cousin's helping you, your grandma's helping you, so you can and when you're struggling, you're gonna try and do everything you can to keep it cheap. And again, it's all of a sudden, and it usually takes a generation, right? So it's the children of the first immigrants that come over and say, no, this is an art, this is a craft, and we're going to elevate it. And then there is always that resistance, So another one that I love hearing is like, your restaurant isn't authentic unless their whole dining room is full of Asian people.
Or your staff.
Or your
right?
staff,
yes.
So talk about that a little bit. Like, what are those obstacles, and how do you overcome? So when you get those reviews, when you get those people, like, do you ignore it? Do you kind of confront them? Do you try and educate them?
I try to ignore them, And Mandu opened like a year before Yelp started. So
perfect timing.
Yeah, it was terrible, right? So we opened, and then everyone's like, "Oh, there's this like thing called Yelp, and like if you follow it, like a lot of people will come to your restaurant, or you can see what's like happening in real time." And I was like, "I don't know, I don't want to know what's happening in real time, And we started to see a lot of prejudices coming out in these online reviews, right, from the safety of a computer, right? And specifically with Korean food, you had a lot of these misconceptions of what we do, right? Come across on these, online reviews, and that really screwed with me, and I think that was something that I had to learn to just not read until, sometimes you look at the general rating, right, and there's like, group thought or the group theory, right? If you have 500 reviews and you have a 1-star rating, overall rating, something's wrong, right? But generally, if you have a pretty good average rating, like I'm not gonna lose sleep over one person who had a bad experience, right? And maybe if I do read into it, maybe our team did screw up, and that's something to look at, and we fix it and we address it with the team, right? But I think, going back to the online reviews and to your question about the obstacles, more often than not, the negative reviews will have nothing to do with the food. It will be, I walked into Mandu or Anju or CHIKO, right? Was greeted by a white host, then a white server came by, and then I didn't see a single Korean person in the kitchen, right? This is not a real Korean restaurant. I'm like, we're not in Korea. Where are these mysterious Korean restaurant workers that you want living in D.C.? I see one right there. Sorry, Eddie, but he doesn't work at a Korean
They're all at
restaurant.
Stanford. They're not working in kitchens.
Do you want to see a grown woman cry? Yes. I've been there where I actually, like recently, allowed myself to fall into this trap where this Korean American blogger, she's like, here, I'm here to parachute, and was like rating it, the whole thing, and like, well, we see a lot of old people here who are not Korean and who don't know a lot about Korean food, and it's so expensive, and it was just like, and it was just a mackerel for $30, you know, and it was so like degrading to me. So I did reach out to her. I was like, hey, sister. I was like, as a Korean American sister, I just wanted to like say that like, you know, that wasn't just a mackerel. She's like, well, why didn't the servers tell me that? There was nothing there indicating what, you know, you told me. I was like, yeah, but still, like, I'm trying, you know, that's just not what you do to your Korean American sister. You know, I was trying to explain, and she literally reposted everything I said onto her feed. And I was just like, and I was crying I was just like so upset because I was like, this is why we can't move forward. It's because we don't even value ourselves. And then my son, who's 5, he's like, are you okay? And he's like, it sounds like she just wants to open her own restaurant. Why don't you just tell her to open her own restaurant? I was like, that's the best answer I've heard yet. So I don't say it all the time, but in my mind, I was like, with all these like complaints, well, yeah, let's see you have the courage to put yourself out there and run a staff and get up every day when sewage is up. You know, like, you do it. I want you to source all these things. I want you to do it and put it together and put a restaurant together. It sounds like you want to open your own restaurant. Sounds like, and I think that's the kind of mentality we have to have, but I think we need to talk about it more, how we need to value ourselves more, whether it's self-hate or we lack to value ourselves, you know what I mean? And that free labor that came from our moms, from our grandmas, that was a lot of work. I mean, all day, I remember my mom was cooking all day long cooking. And I can't even do half of what she does at home for my kids. And I feel guilty, but it's so much work. Korean food is so much work. And in order to preserve it, if you don't want it to die, we need to value it. And we need to stand up and say, I'm willing to pay for that. That is art, that is craft, that's preservation, that's nutrition. These are nutritious food. And we need to value it. It's like that, we need to start there. I think that's the conversation we need to have. And then we can move forward. Because if not, we're just gonna cut our costs down. Okay, I'm gonna cut out keesing dough, it's too expensive. I'm gonna go to the commercial one. And so we lose all these, well, it's too expensive to make kimchi, I'm gonna buy kimchi. Okay, it's too expensive, so I'm just gonna, well, everyone wants free panchan, so I'm just gonna do the cheapest panchan I can put out instead of quality panchan. We're gonna start to lose our culture because we don't value to pay for our food. And I think that's a really important thing we need to talk about.
Yeah, I agree. So in terms of like preservation, you know, I think because of the popularity of Korean restaurants and because of the numerous awards that are in existence, and thankfully a lot of Korean restaurants are winning most of these awards now, right? There's a drive for younger Korean chefs to do something different, to do these, you know, for lack of a better term, like super progressive menus, right? So I feel like we're losing some of that talent pool to do something where it's not rooted in the foundational basis of Korean cooking and Korean food that's very recipe driven, right? And there's a need, you know, something got to me. I was in New York and we're having this like delicious meal, and it was at a very, you know, rustic style Korean restaurant, and it was a delicious jjigae, right? And the guest I was with was like, I was like, oh, isn't this so good? He's like, yeah, but it's just like, you know, it's just like a basic Korean soup. And I'm like, but do you find it delicious? And he was always like, oh yeah, it's delicious. I was like, so why'd you call it basic? He's like, well, there's nothing innovative about it.
Oh, that was part of that blogger's critique, was there was not enough French influences. She was surprised by that because I was a Michelin-starred restaurant.
Oh my God.
And there was not enough French
Doesn't take long for 2 chefs to start bitching about people. We just need some whiskey and some sake and We can go for hours.
But it's a real thing, though, right? Like, he was like, there's nothing innovative about it, right? And I was like, what is wrong with having a perfectly made kimchi jjigae, right? We need to keep that tradition alive, especially in the States. And there's a reason why there's a lot of these modern Korean restaurants like opening up everywhere, because some of the standards, like in Annandale here, Centerville, New York, Flushing, 32nd Street, K-Town, a lot of those standards that have held down Korean food in the States since the 80s, right, are closing because those owners' kids didn't become restaurant owners, they didn't become chefs, right? They went into other industries, which is the American dream, right, for those immigrant parents, There's nothing wrong with that, but there's no younger generation that's going to take the mantle and keep those traditions alive in the States. You're going to start losing a lot of what made us who we are.
So what is the advice that you give to younger chefs? Or specifically, younger chefs who want to do Korean food? Do
research, and education, and being proud of the fundamentals, right? Once you have the fundamentals, and once you know how to work with napa, right? Once you know how to work with scallions, there's so many things you can do with pa, right? Once you get those foundational recipes and flavors and techniques down, there's no limit of what you can do with, Korean food, right? Like, at Nami, what you're doing now, you're putting on a pretty aggressive menu, I would say, in terms of Korean barbecue restaurant. I don't know if I'm doing something wrong here. But, and you're in Louisville, right? Not necessarily like the densest Korean population in the United States, But you're still pushing the boundaries while also keeping things rooted in the fundamentals of Korean cuisine, right?
Certain things shouldn't be changed. If you're not making it better, I don't know, deconstructing something where some soups are super hot, and they're supposed to be, and when you serve it in a demi-tasse or something, it loses its goodness, I think. And sometimes it is about having the confidence that it is good enough. Mm-hmm. It is what it is. It's good enough, and it's beautiful enough, and to respect it for what it is. And I think there is still some insecurity on our end that we're not good enough, without fussing it up, without, maybe there's a little bit of insecurity. I feel more happy now with this parachute menu because I haven't made as much kimchi as I did now, which makes me more feel in tune with being Korean. The old menu was delicious, but it was there was times where I wouldn't even make kimchi, it was a fresh kimchi or a Chinese style kimchi, or it was a Japanese style kimchi, but it wasn't Korean kimchi. And so it was everyone else's cuisine done with a Korean touch, not Korean cuisine. So I feel a little more true to myself now, and I feel more happy that I've come to this kind of maturing to this level. But then some people want that, fussiness, I don't know because that is what is Michelin or whatnot. But I think there's also, I have new people coming to Parachute I love the old Parachute, but I love this one even better. It's more balanced. The food is more balanced, and it just the bean bread, it overpowered everything. But Korean food, it's about everything, the whole experience. And so that was a goal. Korean food is about balance, right? I feel you leave satisfied and but without feeling heavy. Mm-hmm. And sometimes there's it's great to add cheese and things like that, but sometimes it's almost everything has cheese now, everything, and it's I feel we're losing some of that Korean soulfulness, which was it's a little bit of lightness too to the food, which made it delicious and healthy. Mm-hmm.
And I think just to wrap it up quickly, really appreciate both of your perspectives of innovations. I mean, I think honestly, I in the last whatever it was hour, I learned a lot about you guys, and I've learned a lot about food, and I think that perspective is so important as Korean food progresses as a culture, as K-pop gets more popular, as all that. There's something about Korean culture which is respect your elders. You know, there's something ingrained in me, and probably every Korean here. It's like you just respect your elders, and I think part of that gets, you know, kind of morphs into the food too. Like you respect your elders when it comes to recipes, ingredients, cuisine, techniques, fermentation. And I think if we can keep respecting our elders, we can be as progressive as you want, but just have one foot or one hand in the past always, and to do that. So thank you very much. This has been awesome. I hope you guys have enjoyed it. We're going to open it up. Oh yeah, give them a round of applause. I hope that if you've taken one thing away tonight is that do not leave negative reviews on Yelp. That's what this is the whole crux of this. But I do want to take, we have a few minutes for Q&A. So if anyone has some questions and answers, right here in the front. Oh, all right. She just.
How are you? I have a question. Being a native New Yorker, I love the scene of Flushing. But they're saying now that DMV is the best, you can find the best Korean food out of the country. What is your favorite spot in the DMV outside of your restaurant? And also, if you are in any of the major cities, New York, the DMV, or California, what is the best restaurants that you've been to?
Who's going to touch that one? Best Korean restaurant in the DMV?
I think it depends on what you're looking for, right? Like barbecue. Yeah, well, it depends on what I'm in the mood for, right? Because like there are very few restaurants that do like a full menu. Rather you go to a restaurant because they specialize in a certain segment of Korean cuisine, right? So barbecue for me is Mokja Mokja in Fairfax. I'm sorry if there's an owner of another Korean barbecue restaurant.
No, you can't. It's politically charged. You can't touch that. Do you have a favorite Korean restaurant in any city in America? Outside of yours?
That's such a tough question.
Tough one.
Do you?
Yeah, I don't like Korean restaurants.
Oh,
no. No, there's a Korean restaurant in LA. I'm terrible with names, but they serve everything's like in brass, and they serve like the chilled, like pine nut noodles. Oh my god!
Oh, it's big, right?
It's big. It's a chain.
Yeah, it's called.
Now there's this huge kind of trend of like Korean chain restaurants coming to the States, and they're doing, you know. But I also am a huge fan of what is it, BCD tofu?
Yeah.
Yeah, they've been around for a while, but to me they've always done a solid job. You don't have. Next question.
What's your favorite dish on the menu that you'd be most proud to serve your best friend? And second one is, what is the most popular menu at your restaurants or the restaurant?
Most popular has been, will always be bibimbap. I call it like the gateway drug to like Korean cuisine, right? But like if you do it well, so we talked about this earlier. I will never eat a bibimbap for the rest of my life because I've served I think 1 million by this point. My mom always says this: Korean food is about harmony, right? And bibimbap is, when it's done correctly, is a harmonious dish, right? It is the texture of the rice. It is, you know, our standard default meat for our bibimbap is bulgogi, right? So really well-made bulgogi. That, you know, bul means fire, right? So that has that slight smokiness and char to it, right? Individually seasoned and prepared vegetables that all work harmoniously together. As you mix everything up with the egg and then the gochujang, you create this harmonious bite, right? So again, when it's done well, I think it can be a beautiful dish and showcases Korean food very well. It's just become, like, the Korean government actually chose bibimbap to be like a vehicle to promote Korea, right, through tourism. And there's a reason for that because it, you know, represents symbolically with the different colors, you know, in the bowl. But flavor-wise, I think it does encapsulate Korean cuisine. So that is the most popular dish at all of our restaurants. I wouldn't go as far as to say it's like the most proud dish that I have. dakjim, probably, is been a staple of the Mandu menu. Now it's at Anju, now it's at CHIKO. It's a dish that my mom would make me ever since I was born, and my sister. And it made it on the first menu. It's still on our menu. It's like a really homey dish where it's just simply braised chicken thighs, potatoes, and onion with gochugaru, soy, mirin, and it's just like such a comforting mother's like hug that I'm very proud that it's well received. But I eat like one of the dishes that like I will still eat at the restaurant.
Do you have a favorite?
So the hamilpajan on our menu is very popular. You get it at a lot of Korean restaurants, but I think the way we make it's pretty like fantastic. So when someone asked for the recipe, I said no. Is that kind of? I usually share recipes, but this
You wouldn't even give me the recipe.
Because like it took us so long to figure out how to get it just the right amount of batter around each vegetables. There's like Chinese chives, Korean chives, scallions, onions. There's so much vegetables in there, like different chilies. And then we serve it with a Hanaga brown rice vinegar. It's a 13th-generation brown rice vinegar maker in Korea. It has almost like this malt vinegar flavor to it. It's so delicious. And it's the way it's so airy and light. And it's so simple, but it's done with that modern twist. And I personally love making jigaes. I love soups because you can layer the flavors like in there with like long simmer the bones or long simmer or the sundubu, like the lobster sundubu, you can get that lobster flavor in there. And it's also something that reminds me of home and the sound of my dad opening the pots when he came home from work. It was like clang, clang, clang. There was always like 2 or 3 pots of soup at home, and that to me was being Korean American. So yeah, and papingsu. Our papingsu is fantastic. People love it.
You have a Korean restaurant now. What's your?
Yeah.
No, in the back.
Oh my God.
Hi. I just
It's your
like
night. I'm just a
comment
moderator.
that how wonderful this evening has been. I've been living in the DC area since 1980s when my parents came to DC to start a restaurant. And at that time, they decided against opening a Korean restaurant, but opening a Japanese restaurant for 2 reasons. One, that not many people knew much about Korean food, and 2, they did not want to spend the money or the effort to make banchan for the Korean restaurant. So it's great to see such huge community and restaurants that are opening. I just wish there were more Korean restaurants in DC proper. I mean, I appreciate Anju and CHIKO, but they just don't want to.
Danny doesn't want to see more Korean restaurants in DC proper. In
That's
fact,
false.
whenever someone tries, he sends his mafia team out there and says, "You don't want to open. Not my backyard. You don't open." Yes. I don't know. She's picking them. I'm not. I
Hi,
keep pointing at people and then you're.
Thanks so much. I've really enjoyed the talk, and happy Korean American Day. I really appreciated the comments around the preservation of the traditional flavors and techniques, and honoring and respecting, elders. And I'm just wondering, are there like culinary schools that exist? Because when I think about chefs getting trained, we always think of Paris. And are there institutions like that that exist that really teach and retain those techniques in Korean food and Korean cooking?
There's actually a royal cuisine school if you go to Korea. And I did that when I went to Korea in 2006, so hopefully they're still there. But it was like the granddaughter of the last cook of the last king and queen of Korea. And so they preserved like all of the traditional royal cuisine. And then it was, my Korean wasn't good enough to really understand because they had given books with so much history about banchan, everything, all the history behind the food. But it was fascinating. They also taught you how to make duck, and so fascinating and so amazing. The first time I had pine mushroom jangaji, I was like, my mind was blown. I was like, this is like, it should be like in a Michelin-starred restaurant, But there's that. You can look into that. It was really good.
Hi, thanks for being here. So I grew up Korean American myself and from Los Angeles. And I was wondering if you guys ever had like a lunchbox story growing up and how that influenced you to be a chef.
Yeah. So my mom had a deli when I was like in elementary school with one of her best friends. It was in Old Town Alexandria. It was called Piccadilly. They bought it from this like British couple, so that's why it was called Piccadilly. So like the sandwiches were called like the Lady Di and like the Prince Charles and like all these things. It was bizarre. So I got sick of like having these deli sandwiches for lunch every day because she would just take home some of the deli meat and that would be at lunch the next day. So, you know, once or twice a week we'd have like a Korean like lunchbox. And I didn't like kimchi when I was younger. I loved gakdugi, right? I think just texturally as a kid, I just loved something more crunchy. But radish especially smells a bit more intense than kimchi does when it's like stored in a container. It literally smells like fart, right? So on the bus on the way to school, and I was like, oh, Danny farted again, Danny farted again. I'm like, no, it's just my mom's kimchi, you know. But yeah, you know, it turned me off from wanting to bring that food to school, right? Because no matter if it's in jest or not, as a kid and being impressionable, it gets to you, right? And, you know, I think that did shape how I am now of being, I guess, having more pride in what we do and like not being scared of something smelling because it should smell, you know, like something like kimchi. But you know, I don't have kids, but my sister has a son who's 10, and he will actually like get like they'll order from Mandu, you know, live in the city, and he'll take leftovers to school. And I ask him, I'm like, you know, do you get made fun of? He's like, no, everyone like wants to eat my food, you know. So to see that now, you know, decades later, like I can't help but be proud to see some progress, you know, in there.
I have a question. So I guess for each of you guys, what year med or law school were you guys in when you decided to drop out and be a chef?
What was the question? What would be what?
What year in college were?
When did you guys decide to be a chef? It was a joke.
No, I have a bachelor's degree. I don't know about you guys.
I did too.
When did you guys want to
first
transition?
year in college, I dropped out of pre-med.
I know.
Actually, I told my dad, I think I was 12, and I said, I'm going to be a chef. And he was like, yeah, Billy's going to be an astronaut, fine. and every 3 years he'd ask me, he's like, what are you going to do now? I'm like, I'm going to be a chef. I said, what do you do now? I'm going to be a chef. And then right around college, he got real worried. And as it's Korean culture, as the firstborn, whatever, you know, immigrant in family, like it's really important to go to college. I didn't want to go to college, but I said, I'll go to college because I have to graduate from American university. I said, and I did it. I fulfilled my 4 years, and I went and got a job making $6.25 an hour washing dishes at a restaurant. And I said, screw you, Dad. I'm going to pursue my career.
I almost went to the military to cook. Seriously. I'm the last of 4 daughters in a Korean household, and so by the time they got to me, my dad was paying for 2 weddings, 3 sisters in college. I had gotten into Northwestern, and when he saw the bill, he said, and he kind of muttered under his breath, like, if you were a son, I would send you. And I didn't want to be a burden, and my parents were going through financial hardship at the time. So I also was looking into becoming a chef, so I shadowed a few chefs in my junior year in high school. And so they all told me to go to Kendall College, culinary school, and so I was like, okay, well, I can go there for 2 years, or I can go to military school. But I sort of chose a path of least resistance for my parents, but I was also, it kind of like scarred me for a little bit, because when my dad sent me there, he said, well, if you were my son, I'd kick your ass. But because you're a daughter, at least you could be a good wife, and then you could be a good cook at home. And so a little bit of like patriarchy, a little bit. And what's funny is I went from one patriarchy to a patriarchy of culinary. And it was like military. It was like boot camp. And it was like locker room talk, even at school. And I was like, what the hell did I get myself into? But I stuck with it because it's still a passion of mine. And if, man, it's not boring for sure. And everybody needs to eat. You can always find a job. But ultimately, my dad came around when I got, when I got into Top Chef. He was like, okay, now I think you can make a career. But actually, maybe it was my first executive chef position when I proved to him that I could make a career out of this.
I think, we joke around, but I really, really do think for any male daughter, son, daughter, to go into the culinary field, especially in kind of our generation, it was a big push, like for our parent, all of us, our parents, this is not what they thought we were gonna do, and it was a real cultural pushback to be like, no, I'm not gonna be a dentist or an accountant or a lawyer, or I'm gonna do this, and some of y'all younger kids have to understand the road that we paved. It was a hard, I don't know if like you, it was a hard, I don't know, maybe your mom was a little more accepting of it.
I have an older sister who's a very successful attorney, so she like took care of that for me. When I told her that I was gonna go full throttle into this, she actually said, I know. She's like, you were built for this.
Oh, nice.
So, luckily, she was very supportive of it. But I think back then she thought I would take over. She had a Chinese restaurant in National Airport from 1997 when it remodeled. And I think she thought I was going to take over like the Chinese restaurant there. But I think now, she looks back to that time and, my father passed away when I was a freshman in high school. So I grew up basically watching my mom cook, and not just cook, but like run a small business. And I was just fascinated by it. And also knew the work that went into it, because she was never home, right? So I think that was just ingrained in me since I was 14, I thought it was a normal life, right? Like what we do, and we still do a living, unfortunately, but it's, I know no other way, I guess.
All right, we have time for like one or two more questions.
I'll let you choose this.
Right there.
This one, all right.
What was your criteria for picking?
There's who I can see. I don't have my glasses. So I'm like,
oh, really? Sorry for anyone in the back. He's the.
Thank you for all of your great stories. I just wanted to hear a little bit more about your side gigs, for lack of a better term. I think, all three of you have like your little initiatives and things like that going on. And I was wondering how much of that is influenced by your, Korean American upbringing. Thanks.
I'll go. So the abundance setting was something I've been thinking actually after the Me Too movement happened. And actually there's, if you look at how many top chefs there are in independent restaurants, it's a very small minority who are women at the top, which is ironic because when you think of food, you think of like moms and grandmothers. But in the professional world, it's very difficult for women to rise to the top. There's like a 54% graduation from culinary school, but only like 6 to 7% at the top, of women. So I think a lot of it is because systemically, it's actually very difficult to raise a family and do these 14-hour work days in restaurants, night shifts, cost of childcare, healthcare, all these things that you don't think about behind the scenes when you're going out to eat at a restaurant, when you're paying for your food, that these are actually people raising families. And for women, I know for me, as a fact, a lot of women drop out when they think, this is impossible, I can't do this with a kid, like having a family. And when I had my first son, my mom said to me, are you gonna give up being a chef? I think this is like, what's gonna happen to your dream? And I said, oh, jeez. I said, I'm not gonna give up. I'm not gonna give up. I'm gonna keep going, no matter what. But it was hard. And I think there's so few women visibly there. So this initiative happened after COVID started. And because COVID was so hard, difficult, we were forced to close our fine dining rooms. That it gave me some space to do something in this area that I've always wanted to do. And I think one of the key components is mentorship. So we have a mentorship program that puts together 3 leading chefs who are our moms in the industry with 3 up-and-coming moms in the industry. So they shadow, they receive food benefits like through the farmer's market. And we worked a lot actually with the Lee Initiative too. So we have some intersecting goals. It would be great to crack the childcare code. That was one of my goals too, because there's not enough resources for us, like to find the childcare to continue your dream. But I think the goal is to get women to advance to entrepreneurship, to executive levels, because once you are there, you have more opportunities. So that's what the Abundance Setting is doing. And I would love to launch in the DC. We just launched in LA with Mary Sue Milliken, Katiana Hong, and Stephanie Izard. We launched in Chicago, and I think DC being, where you have the impact on policy, it'd be so great to be here too. So that's one of my goals, is maybe to do a mentorship program here.
It's awesome. We would love to sit here and answer all your questions, but like a good Korean crew, we have to go sing karaoke. So thank you for coming, and I appreciate it.